listening to Teatro Mundi Live. Welcome to Staging Cities, a new podcast series from Teatro Mundi. Looking at the ideas on the intersection of stagecraft, architecture, and urban planning. We are borrowing from the toolkit of theatre making to think about city making. This new podcast accompanies a series of books we're working on with NI10 publishers from Rotterdam. In these first three podcasts in Staging Cities, we are discussing storytelling and architecture, drawing on ideas from the first volume produced with NI10 that is out just now, Concrete and Ink, Storytelling and the Future of Architecture. We invited 6 writers who contributed to the book into conversations around structures and buildings that make up the city. The tower block, the mall and the museum, the shed and the ruin. My name is Marta Michalowska. I'm Associate Director at Teatro Mundi, and I'm hosting these 3 podcasts in the Staging Cities series. And now I would like to welcome artist and writer Crystal Bennis and writer Sophie McIntosh.
Hello.
Hello.
Into a conversations around the sheds and the ruins, which is the final podcast in this series.
Welcome to Marlin Station. For your safety and security, CCTV is in use throughout London Underground.
And before we start talking a little bit about some rather temporary structures or fallen structures in the city, perhaps I will ask first Crystal to tell us a little bit about her work and practice. And before that, I will tell you that Crystal is an American artist and writer based in Scotland. Her mixed media practice is grounded in long-term projects, the foreground archival research, durational fieldwork, and material experimentation. Her current project is an Arts and Humanities Research Council-funded practice-based PhD that investigates gendered representations of nature in the history of science and feminist critiques of physics. Her writing on architecture and design has appeared in international publications, including Icon, Frieze, Dizengo, and Metropolis. Welcome, Crystal. Please tell us a little bit about your work.
Thank you. It's really nice to be here with you both talking about this really interesting book project. So I was trying to even think about how I got involved in this. I guess it was Justinian and you invited me to give a talk at the Whitechapel conference last year. And I remember thinking, even though this project, there's a little bit about this particular research project, which is an extension of my PhD project, which you just mentioned. It's there's a little bit of architecture, and because I have these kind of 2 parallel lives where I'm working as a visual artist, but then as an architecture and design writer. And I remember thinking, are you sure you really want me to talk about particle physics to a bunch of architects and people interested in architecture? And you were both adamant. So I thought, okay, well, let's see what comes out of this. And I suppose the ultimate point of interest for me in terms of physics and science more general is not necessarily the research that's being produced, but it's the kind of culture in which the research is being produced. So there's a really lovely idea by an anthropologist of physics called Sharon Trawick, where she talks about the physicists as their self-image as a culture of no culture, because they're so objective and the way that their methods are really grounded in objectivity. So the self-image is this idea of a culture of no culture. And I find this absolutely fascinating. Like, it's obviously not true, but in trying to pick apart how this is not true, one of the strategies I use to do this is look at the origin myths around the founding of certain sites of scientific research. So CERN is one of the biggest, it's like the biggest particle physics research facility in Europe. So it's an obvious target for me. So in looking at these origin story, the myths around the founding and the founding fathers, in the same way as like, you know, the American myth of the founding fathers. And there's just a lot of interesting parallels. But so in trying to pick apart these myths around, you know, how they even came to be situated in the locations that they're situated in, who were the people who were involved, how did they make all these decisions, relationships between the scientists and the governments, both for funding, but also for access, for land. And then things like the architecture and the design of the site start to emerge from some of those questions. And although they do play a really important part, it's not the most important part, but it's still really interesting to look at maybe things like architectural design as signifying other things, like what the priorities are and where the money goes to, and those kind of start to speak about the political relationships. So that's something that I'm interested in overall in my research, and that's also, so the specific story of the history of CERN is what the piece that I wrote for the book is about.
Thank you so much for that, Crystal. That's a great opening to our conversation. And now I'll ask Sophie McIntosh to tell us a little bit about how she got to write the piece for Concrete and Ink. And Sophie is a writer based in London. Her fiction, essays, and poetry have been published by Granta, The White Review, The New York Times, and Stinging Fly, among many others. Her debut novel, The Water Cure, was longlisted for the Man Booker Prize in 2018, and her second novel was published recently in 2020. That's Blue Ticket.
Hi, thank you. It's so nice to be here and be talking about these things. I think obviously as a writer, again, when I kind of just started thinking about architecture, I think I always think about writing as my writing specifically as being quite visual and having a really strong visual element, but it's also that speculative element is really important to my practice. And kind of, I guess, as I've written more and I've kind of built my body of work, I've realized how much of a place, how much of a role the kind of cities and other environments play in it. And there's always quite a both like a disconnect and a symbiosis between the kind of countryside and nature and the cities themselves. And it's kind of interesting because I guess in my work, it's not really particularly world building-y. It's very much kind of like, it's very character focused, but at the same time, we have structures kind of like in my first novel, The Water Cure, it takes place all in one big ruined hotel, and that hotel almost becomes like its own ecosystem. And so from that kind of base, that is kind of, I'm interested in exploring like, the potential of kind of future cities and environments through this kind of speculative lens, but not doing it in a way that's necessarily like, oh, like a skyscraper and, you know, like lots of like glass and, you know, futuristic cars whizzing around, but thinking more in terms of, I guess, how we interact with the environment and how kind of things like trauma might be manifested and, you know, the potentiality of climate change and stuff like that within it. And so I think that's pretty much my kind of approach to it, the kind of the speculative and
Thank you so much for that, Sophie. And then maybe to get a feel for the writing that is part of the book, we just get each of you to read a short fragment from your text, and then we can really dive into looking at the strange structures that appear in your pieces of writing, whether they are real or imagined. Crystal, do you want to go first, please?
Sure. So I'm just going to read a really small section of this text. So this is about halfway through. The text it's quite fragmented. So it's basically an essay. It's a nonfiction piece. And it's quite fragmented, so it's split up, and I'm looking at the origin story, the origin myth of CERN since its founding in the 1950s, and then looking at how that happened and jumping all over between modern day time and then back to the 50s and then projecting at the end into the future. So this is a section from my second fieldwork visit to CERN, which was in February 2020. It was just really, it was weird because I'd been in China, actually. So I'd just come back from China. And it was just the last trip I made before the kind of first lockdown, which has kind of subsequently colored all of this. Anyway, so this is my second visit back to CERN, and I had just been reflecting on what a weird environment is, standing on a hill kind of in the middle of the site and looking at everything. So non-scientific visitors are frequently astonished by the distinct lack of aesthetic interest at CERN. How can it be that such enormous budgets do not buy more beautiful buildings? In general, investment in architecture is not, and never has been, a foremost concern at CERN. From its inception, spending priorities have essentially boiled down to all science all the time. Given the vast amounts of money required to build particle accelerators and their experimental detectors, physicists already operate in a highly competitive funding environment. If there's not enough money for research, what scientists would really support funding for extraneous luxuries such as architecture? That said, CERN's public relations department has lately changed its opinion as to the value of grand architectural gestures in the never-ending quest to garner broader public support and increased financial contributions from member states. In 2019, after years of what amounts to architectural neglect, CERN announced plans for a new iconic building to house an education and outreach center designed by Renzo Piano. In line with its budget priorities, however, the new building will not actually be paid for by CERN, but by private donations. Apparently inspired by the, quote, fragmentation and curiosity intrinsic to the nature of CERN sites and the CERN site and buildings, the building's design is essentially a series of 5 interconnected pavilions, 3 boxy and 2 tubular, spanning the large, busy road leading into central Geneva. This orientation to the road is deliberate, with everything else fenced off behind security checkpoints for authorized visitors only. This road is essentially the only public space at CERN. Piano's design appears generous, while maintaining this strict boundary between public and private space.
Thank you so much for that. And you've chosen a great fragment for actually discussion by literally painting for us what that space might look like once it's finished and completed. And the idea that a grand scientific gesture on a European scale would actually not have any glamorous building is quite fascinating in itself. It's not something that perhaps one would expect thinking of other grand buildings housing, say, culture. In the previous podcast here, we're talking about the ambitions of international museums. And then in a way, thinking about science as something that is really focused on its raison d'etre rather than creating beautiful spaces, rather fascinating. But we can park this idea for a moment and now hear for a little bit from Sophie's piece, which is fictional.
Yeah, so I'm going to read a little bit from The Middle of Wild City, which is about a city basically which has kind of been allowed to be aggressively reclaimed by nature. And I think, the feelings of one particular character towards this, and it's sort of, I kind of wanted to think about, this idea of sentimentality and this idea of wanting to kind of return to nature, but also the kind of complications in that. And again, this is a very aggressive kind of reclaiming, and part of the fun, I guess, of working with fiction with ideas like this is you kind of do anything and go a bit fantastical as well, and kind of go beyond the scope of what would actually be kind of possible. I'm just going to read a little bit. In a city where nothing could be built, or not in the way that I understood it, a new kind of symbiosis had to be found. But it wasn't one that came naturally, Jennifer told me, as she showed me from house to house, and the communal areas for sorting foraged things, butchery, the making of other necessary things. I found myself taking more care with every step, seeing things like the yellow heart of a flower I'd never seen before, or an emphatic star in the dirt. It was natural to want to repair, to replace a fallen brick or pane of glass, she explained. There had to be a mindset shift from fear to acceptance. They treated the crumbling houses as normal but carefully, anxious not to trigger rot, to try and keep them intact for as long as possible. Beyond that, when they started to fall beyond repair, they adapted. The realization that things could leave little trace, that a roof could be mud or thatch or pleated branches, that a house could slowly leave its houseness behind and return to shelter, return to home, to the point when things fell, was almost a celebration for what could spring up in its stead. And the knowledge that when these things of hay bales and leaves fell too, as they would, the earth would enfold them back so easily. I first felt it, this home, in the house where we would be staying. Drop your bags, the expedition leader told us. It had once been a small apartment complex, 2 stories high. Enough remained of it that I could recognise. A bathtub in the former bathroom now used as a planter for tomatoes and herbs, a little patch of tiling in a corner kept, perhaps, for decorative reasons. I ran my hand over a portion of remaining original wall, the useless light switch still there, the layers of plasterboard and brick and a curl of dirty white paint still visible, and one unbroken window, the rotten sill overgrown with yellow blooming wood. Apart from this, the roof was lattice branches, a waterproof layer of the same wood. It smelled fresh and green. The tall glass door leading out onto what must have once been a patio was long shattered, but fragments like jewels remained in the grass. I found them when I went on my hands and knees to take samples of the earth, but also to remember what soil could feel like, its wet smell, and what could be lurking inside it, the teeming ants and the snails with their shells. Sometimes in the other city, back again in my childhood, the mirror city in another world from here, a prize was a skinny earthworm pulled from yellowed grass. Anemic, too dry. Put them back, I told the other children, not out of fear of the worm, but rather fear for it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Sophie. It's quite fascinating, this idea of a city that is allowed to share its space with all the non-human life, and actually the acceptance and the leap of faith one would need to make to live in a space like that. Well, thank you so much and it's great to have to hear a little bit of the work that is part of the book. Obviously, the listeners can order the book from Teatrum Mundi's website and read the pieces in full themselves, in addition to all the other works that are collected in the book. But we created this podcast series to think about the kind of key structures that we've identified that many of the writers explored throughout the book. And 2 of them are the kind of structures that the shed, which is something that is perhaps temporary in its nature, that is perhaps represent the ideas of DIY and often requires a garden or an outside space to exist. And the other one, the ruin, which is what happens to ultimately all human creation of buildings. And partially the book deals with the ideas of time. So thinking about the ruins, it occurs in many of the pieces that we've seen, the idea that a city is created out of compacted layers of time built on top of each other. And the ruin really not only is a part of the city, but also part of foundation of every kind of human housing and human space that where we live. But maybe we can start with the ideas of the shed as something that is perhaps a bit improvised. And maybe I'll start with Crystal here, because you actually mention the idea of a shed in your text as the future-looking scientists seem to be not that bothered by the aesthetics of the buildings in which they work. And I think you actually exactly use the word shed.
Shed. It's because I would say that the kind of classic typology of a site of scientific research, but particularly a big, expensive one, where not the architecture is expensive, but the scientific equipment is expensive, is really the shed, with the kind of classic like corrugated metal, very like quickly built, cheaply built. Actually, it was really interesting just listening to Sophie read that little bit from her text, because so it's not CERN, but it's Fermilab, which is the National Accelerator Laboratory in the United States. It's one of the big labs there, and it was built in the late 60s. And it's in the suburbs outside of Chicago. And it's it's like almost 7,000 acre site, but there's kind of famously when it was all bootstraps and the first director when he was building it. So a lot of the buildings were these kind of corrugated sheds with dirt floors, because they were like, well, we're not going to waste money on concrete foundations when we could just have dirt floors. So it's this kind of incremental process, and everything sort of starts with the shed. And then, gradually, as the scientists revolt from leaky roofs and dirt floors, like very incrementally, you could kind of map it on a timeline with like complaints from the scientists of the terrible working conditions, with these like little incremental improvements to the site, which is also interesting because actually Fermilab is probably, of all the big scientific research sites, in many ways Fermilab is the most aestheticized. So it has like the corrugated sheds are painted, they're bright blue and they're bright orange, and CERN is not that at all. It's just you think that you're walking around either like an industrial estate on the outskirts of a city, or like an airport, that kind of very like junk space, no space, anonymized space. But it's also, CERN is super securitized, so it's not really open to the public. Everything is covered in or surrounded in security walls, where Fermilab is not like that. But yes, the shed is really that was the thing I meant to say, sorry. At Fermilab, the main building there, which is called Wilson Hall, is actually quite a beautiful piece of architecture, but the director claims that it was inspired by Beauvais Cathedral, which I just think is a quite amazing claim to make. It really doesn't look anything like a cathedral, let alone the specific architecture of Beauvais Cathedral. But at least they were sort of trying, whereas at CERN, they were really just not interested, despite spending billions and billions of dollars. So it's sheds.
What is, to say, a lay person that doesn't engage so much with science, the image that comes to mind when thinking about science is more of this clean lab with white tabletops and everyone dressed in well, now they are probably more visible even outside the lab, the suits, the hazard suits, and science requiring almost palaces to conduct its work. But it seems that the exact opposite is true. The scientists perhaps resemble more manual laborer in the conditions in which they're expected to work, and they work in perhaps more warehouses than that are housing their machinery, rather than grand spaces that prime ministers and presidents of countries tour on their photo ops for promoting their investment in research and science. But well, now I would like to hear from Sophie what she thinks about sheds, because in a way you created a city out of, in a way, sheds, temporary structures that are sheltering your characters.
Yeah, it was so interesting to hear about. I would have never, like you said, like you think of like science and a kind of place of like pristine labs and stuff, but maybe think a bit as well in context of my case. I think like when we think about sheds, we obviously think kind of like, a garden shed and just kind of think up. But I was thinking a lot about kind of, I guess, the value we assign to even kind of temporary structures, and kind of how even a temporary structure can just mean so much. I was thinking a lot about prefabs and kind of, I guess, because I was reading about the prefabs that are kind of being demolished, and also I saw one on. I was watching a lot of Homes Under the Hammer. I was living with my parents earlier this year, and I was watching a lot of Homes Under the Hammer, and they had a prefab on it. And thinking about it in terms of these temporary structures, which are homes, because that is something that comes up so much in Wild City. What is a home? What makes a home? What do we invest in a home? And a shed could be a home, a structure that is kind of built with a lifespan can be a home, can be looked after and kind of cared for and like given so much. So idea of kind of, we think of houses and structures as being, impressive or having all this stuff lavished in them, but sometimes it's about more what we give to them psychologically and how we, I guess, react and respond to them emotionally as well.
Yeah, that is a very, very great idea, that it's not so much about the brick and mortar. But maybe before we move on to a kind of a next stage of what can happen to a building, maybe we could think a little bit about the idea of improvisation that also comes through very strongly in both of your pieces. The idea that there a lot of improvisation does happen in the real world of buildings, and how they get shifted, adapted, and move through different stages of their life, not necessarily in a very planned and designed way. Crystal is nodding. Maybe you would like to start.
I know, it's just because it's funny, because we're talking about this, and obviously I wrote my piece all about CERN, but then all of the things that are coming to my mind are about Fermilab, even though CERN is like, it shares a lot of the same hallmarks in this kind of the really like shabby quality of a lot of the building and the temporary adaptions and changing around all the time. But actually this example from Fermilab is just too brilliant not to, because also it links in a little bit to what Sophie was just saying about sheds, more like the garden shed rather than these kind of more industrial space type sheds. But the site on which Fermilab was built in the late 60s, it had been this, it had been a kind of settler farming community in the 19th century. So you have these 19th century slightly grander farming houses, and then in the 50s and 60s you started getting these post-war suburban developments, like almost kind of shed-like houses themselves, which is a little depressing. The kind of bungalow / mobile home type house that was really common in post-war American housing development. But when the Atomic Energy Commission decided that it was going to build Fermilab on this site, it's a really interesting and complicated history that I'm just smashing for the sake of this discussion. But that whole area was appropriated, like compulsorily purchased by the government, and all of the farmers and all of the people who lived in these houses had to vacate, and the new lab appropriated all the existing housing stock. And then it picked them up completely and just moved them, like on flatbed trucks, moved them around the site. So they took the, with the farmhouses, they used them for, the grander farmhouses, they used them for slightly different things. But with the kind of shed-like 20th century housing, those were the original offices for a lot of the lab staff. So before that they even had construction starting on site, they were reusing these homes which they had appropriated. It's just completely fascinating, and CERN doesn't have anything like that. CERN is like a more conventional narrative of reuse, and also there's, because this is experimental physics we're talking about, so it's getting dirty, it's getting mucky, you're building things all of the time. So in as much as you're tinkering with your equipment, you like, why not tinker with the architectural spaces as well and make them work for what you need. And actually there's another thing that's really fascinating at Fermilab that CERN doesn't have, which is a place that they call, and this is kind of treading the lines between sheds and ruins, but it's a place that they call the boneyard. And I've never seen this before at any other scientific site, and it's completely off limits. Like, most of the scientists don't even know that it exists. It's pushed way out to the edge of the site. But it's a place, it's like a graveyard for old experiments. So it's where all the old experimental equipment goes to die. It's partly due to radiation, because they can't just be shipping like irradiated metal off-site, because where would you put it? It's like nuclear waste, right? But in theory, the idea is that it provides like a free store of equipment for building both buildings, like construction and scientific experiments. And I just love that it's called the Boneyard, and it's absolutely brilliant. I rode around there on a little like golf cart by myself, and it was genuinely like one of the most fun days I'd had on any of these spaces. So there is a kind of idea of like reuse and adapting, even if they're not necessarily really good ideas about how to plan for architectural spaces in the first place.
A graveyard of used experiments. That's just truly fascinating. I would love to see that.
Brilliant.
You have a rather different space in your text, so maybe you could talk a little bit about a slightly different, perhaps, improvisation that has to do probably more with dwelling rather than science. Although science certainly is part of the piece as well.
Yeah, I guess in the piece, like my main character is a scientist. She's there specifically to kind of get samples, because like why would you kind of, the idea of going there is like for kind of emotional reasons or like aesthetic is kind of very forbidden. Or not so much forbidden, but kind of, I guess, just not sanctioned, because it's a bit like, well, yeah, there's no kind of room for emotion in that world. But it was actually really interesting writing the story, because I was like kind of in a kind of more microcosmic personal way. I was like midway through like a massive renovation project, and it's kind of that idea of improvisation. When we moved into the house, it needed completely gutting. It'd been empty for like a year. It was really interesting because it'd been like a really well-loved family home, but then it ended up being empty for a year. So obviously you could really see that already it was kind of falling apart. Basically, it's not too strong a word. Lots of things kind of ruined within it, and because of lockdown, we kind of ended up living in it while it was basically getting progressively more ruined. So that was kind of the space that I wrote the story from. I was like in what is now my study, which is now kind of like a white box, because we've progressed to this stage where nothing is actually like finished, but everything is this blank sort of perfect white canvas, and I still have lots of boxes everywhere. But like writing the piece, I just remember we couldn't leave the house much because of lockdown. Obviously, like our garden had just gone completely, like weeds were everywhere, and as much I tried to like do anything, it just was like fighting back against me. I felt like, the plaster was falling off. You open a door and the door kind of comes off the hinges. It was so strange, and I think it was because it was all kind of intensified with the idea that our homes are our spaces now. These are the ecosystems that we exist in completely, and like mine is really like fighting me. And now having fought back, it's interesting. But one thing that I kind of didn't really think about before was, I guess, I thought about the histories of the houses and stuff, and I'm in Walthamstow, so it's a lot of kind of terrace houses and Victorian houses, but I think about how flimsy it is underneath. Like when you start pulling things back, it actually, these are not houses built with a great deal of care. You think they're kind of built to last, but I was like, wow, I've really just been walking around on like these kind of joists, and like with the lath and plaster and stuff coming down, and ours is kind of like one of the cheaper ones, I think, built for kind of a new workforce. It just really gave me a sense of I guess, we think of cities as places of permanence and things being made to last and made well, but it really feels like you kind of just prod something, it could all fall apart. And I'm like, is all of London like this? I think it probably is, but it could all kind of, if we just prod it too hard, it would crumble.
Well, I imagine a lot of even the new buildings are not as solid as they might appear on the surface. But this is actually a really great point. The question that I probably the next thing that I wanted to move on to is something perhaps that sits in between the shed and the ruin. Is that question of repair? Is the question of repair and maintenance and keeping things going before they are allowed to fall down. And actually, if I may actually read a very short quote from your piece, Sophie, which actually probably captures a lot of these ideas quite well. It was natural to want to repair, to replace a fallen brick or pane of glass, she explained. There had to be a mindset shift from fear to acceptance that treated the crumbling houses as normal, but carefully anxious not to trigger rot, to try to keep them intact as long as possible. You did read this piece, this fragment, but I thought that we will underline it here with this idea that to make, in a way, that the whole city depends on this question of repair and what we actually do with architecture, whether we keep it going or we kind of surrender it to natural forces, or we destroy it, which is yet another probably aspects of it. Would you want to, maybe I start with Sophie, maybe do you want to say anything else about this question of repair and whether one chooses to repair or not? Even that we've heard a lot about your personal experience. So.
I guess it's like kind of, I guess we don't think necessarily about if like a rock or something gets chipped. Obviously, it's not the same, but like kind of these natural structures, don't think about kind of repairing them in the same way. And I mean, we don't have to like live in a rock, so it's different. But I think that idea of, in terms of thinking of rewilding, how much stuff should we actually be doing? How should, if we actually kind of intervene too much, do we set off something else that we can't control, or do we maybe do it in the wrong way? I don't know. It's just such a lot of this idea of responsibility. I think so much, we've done so much harm. How do we think about, in terms of sustainability and things? How do we kind of process that into our architecture and into our lives as well? Like when I was living with my parents, like they're so amazing at like they're very self-sufficient, and when we were kind of engaged on our own, making the microcosm, thinking in terms of it's a big responsibility, like how much can we like reuse, and what can we do to source kind of materials sustainably, sentimentality, and is nature like always right? Sometimes nature's not always right, or just finding that way to kind of, I guess, coexist.
That's fascinating. The idea of where's the line? How does one draw a line of when is the point where we should allow to tip things over and make them return to perhaps a different state? But question of repair is probably fundamental to how CERN operates as an organization in itself.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's really interesting because I mean, repair is absolutely central. I mean, that's the bread and butter of being an experimental physicist. This is like, you make a plan, you execute the plan, it doesn't work in any way, shape, or form how you think, and then you're constantly troubleshooting and trying to solve it. But I think that applies pretty exclusively to the experiments themselves. Actually, it's interesting. There's been some writing done about, some studies done about the relationship between scientists and their equipment, and I think that's where you find this sentimentality, and then these questions and self-reflection about what we should save, what we should get rid of. It really applies to the instruments and to the detectors. The architecture, the site, the nature of the landscaping, like that is of no great interest to the majority of kind of working physicists. And in fact, this same anthropologist who I mentioned earlier, Sharon Trawick, there's a whole section of her book about a kind of ethnography of these different particle physics communities, which really talks about the fact that if you are a physicist and you demonstrably show concern for things that aren't science or that are outside of science, whether that's like fashion and personal grooming, that's not cool. That's not part of how we self-identify as physicists, through like our external appearance. So like, of course, there's not going to be demonstrable interest for things like care of the environment and care of the architecture. And it's actually quite interesting because so CERN did have an architect involved, Rudolf Steger, a Swiss, quite a well-known Swiss architect who was hired to master plan the whole site. And I talk a lot about that in the essay. And he was a bit of a megalomaniac, unsurprisingly, and a huge control freak. And normally his clients capitulated and he was allowed to perform that role. But with CERN, you know, they have very strident technical requirements. So Steger was really concerned that he went on a tour of the labs at the US, and he said they all look like gold miners' settlements where they're like planned and built in stages with no overall design. So again, it's this like adaptive reuse or transformation of kind of temporary structures and lots of tinkering, and he hated that. And he was like, CERN is absolutely not going to be like that. And of course it absolutely is like that, and it's still like that to this day. And I was trying to find an example. There's a building, I don't actually know what the building is, but it's in the center of the CERN campus, and I think it may have been a Steger design, and it's really interesting. It has these like big steel I-beams then going down to these, it's quite hard to describe, like A braces all along. They look like sort of cement precast panels that have then all been in like big glass windows, and it's a really cool looking building. And then if you look at the same building on Street View, they've kept the like beams, but they've reclad it in something absolutely hideous. Like it's just, it's horrible looking. So clearly there is like, again, there's not really an appreciation of like the architectural design heritage of some of the original buildings. It survives, but not in any way, shape, or form. It's not really recognizable. Apart from these, you know, they've kept the like most identifiable detail of the building, but basically they've ruined it. So there's clearly not been like a conversation about the aesthetic merit. It was like, we need this building for a very functional purpose, and it needs to suit that purpose. Therefore, like, to hell with whatever was there originally. So I think that pretty much typifies the approach that the physicists have to that in between shed and ruin stage of the buildings.
That is absolutely fascinating. And Sophie, could you have something to add?
Oh yeah,
to
I was
this?
just thinking like it's kind of like a shame, because I was thinking, I don't know, like the idea of, you know, it's such a monumental building, and like if not now, then maybe even for like the future or something, it'd be kind of cool to be like, oh, like look at what happened here. And yeah, thinking in terms of, yeah, I guess like maybe in a way it doesn't matter actually how it looks, because it's what happened inside it, and maybe we don't need to kind of show it off and be like, oh, like how great it was. But I don't know.
Yeah, maybe it seems that the kind of practicalities and the need seems to override anything else, and the kind of the heritage drive in a way is being suppressed quite strongly, which perhaps is something that I'm not sure if this is due to kind of deliberate feel of inducing nostalgia for the old. And perhaps in a country in Europe, that's part of it. The kind of the idea of heritage and preserving is to do with the numerous wars the continent endured, and that destroyed a lot of things and left some intact. And the idea of rebuilding, I know that from the experience of say the city of Warsaw, about which I write in my piece, the idea that the city was so destroyed that it was perhaps better to just leave it and build another city next to it. But the population did prefer the idea of recreating almost from scratch, almost brick by brick, certain buildings in the city. Of course, it was not possible to rebuild the whole place. And then the remainder of it was used. The rubble from the city was used to build a new stadium. So in a way, it remains to this day in the city. Its own remains are part of the kind of new city. But perhaps this is a good moment to think a little about the ideas of future and the imagination of future, which the book very much talks about the kind of the idea of future architecture. But of course, future is very much connected to the ideas of the past. But here, maybe I'll actually start with Crystal, and I would really like to read this quote, because you obviously talked a little bit about this. But in the text you say, whether by nature or by design, physicists tend to be forward-looking. In many cases, even before a new experiment is operational, its kinks not fully ironed out, the next generation iterations will have already been in discussion. Sometimes it feels as if experimental physics were a never-ending Ponzi scheme. I found that quite fascinating, because I actually never realized that actually physics is so much about, it takes so long to create those experiments, and they're constantly making this leap into what's in the future. I somehow think about physics as something that is looking into stars and looking into something, light that arrived from say another galaxy over say millions of years. So the idea of a physicist as someone future looking, especially that they don't tend to look futuristic themselves, is quite fascinating. But maybe you could talk a little bit about this imagination of future that is playing out always in those places.
Maybe it's a little, I'm not exclusively saying physicists are totally separate from all of the other profession or discipline in their obsession with the future. I think a lot of professions are similar. But if you think, that in a European context, architects think of the golden age for the profession as like that post-war period where there was a huge boom in social housing and architects employed by municipalities and things. And I think for better or for worse, for a lot of physicists, that golden age period was the Second World War and immediately thereafter, because obviously their prestige went through the roof and their influence with government after they made the atomic bomb. And so that period is their golden age period, when they had, entree into every Washington office and tons of research funding. And it's been steadily decreasing since then. I mean, the amounts of money that they're working with are still stupendous. But so it's partly an anxiety about their status is contributing to this like constant projection into the future, because you want to have the particle physics community is actually quite small. It's very international. It's very global. They want to have the best students. They want to have the most money for their research. And they want to still have government influence. And because this research is publicly funded, all of those things are very important to ensuring that they have the resources that they feel they need and also that they feel they deserve. So to a certain extent, it's about projecting into the future as if it's already done, like it's a kind of fait accompli, so that it then ensures that what they're projecting into the future can come true. It's also just, there's this culture of like more data. You can never have enough data, like literally not ever. So there will be data from 10 years ago that still has not been analyzed, but that's not important, because what's most important is ensuring that 10 years into the future, that data is still being produced. So it's very interesting to me to see that if you spend time with them there. And like I talk about in the piece, they're already well advanced in terms of getting the next huge, it's like 21 billion euros. It's the next big collider at CERN. And increasingly there's, economics are a bit difficult. Socially, things are not what they were 20 years ago. So there's increasing pushback, but, and I guess, and that causes concern as well. So hence even more of this, if we sell it as if it's like a sure bet, then by doing that, we can ensure that it is, which is, really interesting.
Thank you so much. It's quite fascinating to think about it in this way. Well, Sophie, in a way, a lot of your work is about imagination of future by the nature of the main discipline you chose as speculative fiction. Could you comment a little bit about how you think about the future? How do you imagine future?
It's such a, where do I even start? I don't know. I think it's just, I think when I started writing, it was, well, even now as well, it's kind of taking things that obviously we see and thinking like, well, how far could I push them? And I think, because I used to I used to be a poet. I used to be a poet. I used to write poetry, and I also was a lot more kind of interested in more like visual arts when I was a teenager. And I kind of, I always thought kind of that would be more of my direction. But I think writing became more important for me because that sense of, you know, again, how far can I push it? And actually, I can kind of do anything. And that idea of complete possibility and everything being allowed, I just find particularly like very freeing. And how to kind of think in terms of because I am quite a visual writer as well, how to be able to translate that in a way that kind of creates almost like images with words, I guess. So yeah, that idea of possibility has always been really exciting to me. But I think there's that idea of like kind of responsibility as well, like because a lot of my work is like very, very dystopian, or kind of started out dystopian, and now it's like, well, you know, all this energy in terms of imagining the bad stuff, like, well, surely we could imagine some good stuff, or at least imagine some, you know, good and bad is, you know, it's neither one or the other, but imagine in a way that's more positively, or in a way that has a bit more hope in it perhaps, or in a way that just thinks a bit more critically about how we can engage with the world around us, and how we can do this in a way that is beneficial, or just I think I'm always like kind of trying to open up these little possibilities, like for myself and hopefully like for readers as well, and just to explore kind of different ideas as time goes on.
Yeah, so the idea of having the freedom of actually creating a world that doesn't actually have to necessarily stand fully, it's quite fascinating. And that's probably what I imagine a lot of architects and urban planners envy writers for having this idea that things can be tested through imagination. They don't have to be tested in the reality of things. But that's part of the ideas that we wanted to bring into the book, is the idea that perhaps the creative writing, and particularly fiction, can be a method for testing things, or for testing whether something imagined could hold in reality, by not having, say, an idealized character, a cutout type of character, but maybe characters that bring a lot more different experiences and different behaviors and different backgrounds that can actually help shape cities or shape buildings, not through the kind of idealized model, but through maybe someone that was going to live, inhabit those spaces and obviously transform them. Because perhaps that's what's lacking very often in say design stages, is that once something is built, it gets the life, and then the life happens to it, and those ideas perhaps are not always anticipated. That maybe it won't be it won't be only ideal families living in those buildings or occupying those public spaces. But that also brings me at this point to thinking. We've obviously talked a fair bit about ruins, but maybe we could talk a little bit about the idea of traces and also archaeology. And this is kind of the ending of Crystal's piece. So do you want to talk a little bit about this?
So yeah, because I think one of my favorite sort of little mini histories from the period in which CERN was actually being constructed. So there's the central campus, and then the 4 detectors around the Large Hadron Collider are spread farther away. And during the construction phases for one of those detector experiments, slightly further out in quite an agricultural area in a big field, the construction crews uncovered a 4th century Roman villa. And they were like, shit, this is terrible news, right? So now we have to stop. We have to call in an archaeological team to like excavate and catalog the site. And then decide what we're going to do, because this is exactly where we've planned to build, to like dig up this huge hole so that we can put our detector in the hole and, you know, have everything go okay. And when I went on my second visit, I went to the site, to where the villa was. They covered it back up because they were like, okay, well, they sort of excavated all the important things, sent them to it's just a small like residential villa. It's not any like hugely important building or with hugely important artifacts. But when I went to the site, and then when I went to the detector next door and went underground to actually see the detector, the physicist who I was walking around with, he just kind of made this throwaway comment about how the detector was never going to leave the cavern. And I was like, what do you mean? And he was like, well, it was such a pain getting it down here, and it's so heavy, and it's like by the time the Large Hadron Collider shuts down, it'll be pretty worthless to science. Like the technology will have moved on so far that it'll effectively be completely obsolete. So what we'll probably do is just cover the whole thing over in concrete. And I was like, what? Particularly when kind of juxtaposing it against this 4th century villa that almost exactly the same thing had happened next door. And it's just such a beautiful comparison to me. It's like totally accidental, the idea that you will have, like, I don't know how many years in the future, you'll have these two kind of archaeological ruins next door. But the thing I really loved also is that this idea that the Roman villa and its remains and its artifacts are still kind of comprehensible to us. Like we don't know exactly, we can interpret and make assumptions, but you know, there are some commonalities. Whereas I just love the idea of like, what will it be like if this thing is buried over in concrete and you uncover this massive kind of totally bizarre, like it's a solenoid detector. It's a huge camera to look at particles, and like people digging it up being like, will they be able to make those kind of same will they be able to kind of interpret it and find it comprehensible in the same way that we found this Roman villa interpretable and comprehensible? Or will it just be completely baffling and trying to unpick this society that created this utterly bizarre thing? And I just love, for me, it's like, it's a really rich image. And I'm not a fiction writer, and I don't have that kind of amazing imaginative capacity. So I need history to provide that imaginative capacity for me. But this kind of anecdotal example does that, and I think it's so that's kind of how the piece ends, with that projection into the future, which I just think is really interesting. That actually really hooked me on the piece, and I kept on thinking whether some strange scientific experiment would be in any way familiar to the future people. Would they be like thinking, oh my God, they were using, you know, a piece of stone equivalent to particle physics? Are we going to really, while domestic space ultimately probably hasn't changed that much over the thousands of years. It's still a house has a door and a window usually, and a floor and a wall, which is partially what actually Sophie's proposing. It might be not. It doesn't have all those elements and doesn't leave a trace.
It puts me in mind of something which I'm sure you know so much more about than I do, Crystal, but that idea of like future archaeology and the long-term like nuclear, what's like the warning messages they have it. How do we kind of, with a future archaeological site that's like actually actively dangerous, how do we create something that can be interpreted? But I just find it so interesting, all the kind of ideas that are like thrown up, and like radioactive cats, I believe, is my favorite. But also how kind of radioactive cats, and also this idea of like creating a kind of oral history and culture that people could pass down. I just find it so interesting because it's like, it's so futuristic but also so much in the past, how we'll be thinking about how we communicate these future ideas, how we are looking to the past and kind of assuming that the things that are communicated, the things that we can understand over the generations, like the Roman villa, but also this idea of these spikes in the ground, or stories about radioactive cats, or this kind of almost like a folk culture that's been based around it. I just it's kind of, how do we communicate across the ages, and what are the things that the things that last, and why do we keep returning to these ideas of like these intrinsic old ideas about how we communicate and these visual messages? It's always so interesting to me.
Yeah, definitely. I absolutely agree. There's just one, we're talking here very close to the midsummer, and I was just thinking as a closing remark about the idea that perhaps Stonehenge is none of the things that everyone thinks it is. Maybe it was a scientific experiment. We just don't know how to interpret it, how to narrate this idea of such a long period of time. Maybe it was as sophisticated as CERN at the time. Who knows? But, perhaps this is all we have time probably for, and I really would like to hugely thank you, Crystal and Sophie, for sharing your insights and ideas. And I do hope that the listeners will order Concrete and Ink: Storytelling and the Future of Architecture, which is available both from NI10 publishers and from us at Theatrum Mundi on our website, theatrum-mundi.org. And actually read the stories in full, and not only appreciate the ideas, but also the beautiful writing that is in the book. Thank you so much to both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And all I can have left now is to say that this was the final conversation in the first series of Staging Cities. There will be more coming out once we produce the next book in the series together with the publisher at NI10 in Rotterdam. And for the moment, I would like to thank you for listening, and goodbye.
Welcome to Marlin Station. For your safety and security, CCTV is in use throughout London.